The Declaration of Independence changed things all across the globe, and nowhere more than North America. In this lesson, I want to look at how the Declaration of Independence impacted Native American relations. We're going to look at what was called the Cherokee Wars, which endured the entire Revolutionary War period. Now, you'll recall from an earlier lesson that after the French and Indian War, Britain had gained a massive amount of territory, going from Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and following the Mississippi River Valley. King George III had made a declaration, a royal declaration in 1763, that said this: settlers were allowed to live between Appalachia and the Atlantic. However, between Appalachia and the Mississippi River, that would be Indian territory. And so by 1763, there were very real reasons why the Cherokee, who were a dominant tribe of that area, it was reasonable for them to believe that that land was their own. Of course, they shared it with other Indian tribes. However, about 1774, Daniel Boone, a famous American folklore hero, had begun to take people from the southern United States into what would become Kentucky. That was in 1774. Now, also in 1775, there were a group of North Carolinians who were very wealthy, and they began to speculate on land on the west side of Appalachia. What they hoped to do was acquire some of that land, which was extremely valuable, lots of timber, lots of good farmland, lots of streams and creeks. And they were going to buy the land from the government and then try to sell it off in small pieces, and in that way, make a profit. This was called land speculation. Of course, they didn't actually own that land. Nevertheless, the Cherokee made a deal with North Carolina. They would allow these wealthy men to buy some of their land. But what the wealthy men didn't realize was that same land was also used by other tribes, the Lenape, the Shawnee, and the Chickasaw. They had claims to that land as well. So although the Cherokee gave up some rights, these other nations did not. And so when settlers began to move across Appalachia, there was a great deal of confusion. The Declaration of Independence made this even more confusing, because the question became, what happens when the declaration from 1763, which was made by the British king, no longer holds value? The British king had made a declaration in 1763, but the Declaration of Independence said the United States was no longer bound to that king. You can see the dilemma. The Indians had treaties with the royal governors of the various colonies and also with the British Parliament, but now Britain had lost control of the colonies, and thus the treaties were circumspect. Some of them, most of them, the Americans felt were no longer valid. Instead, that land was very appealing. So in May 1776, the northern Indians around Michigan, so for example, the Shawnee, the Lenape, the Iroquois, the Ottawa, and others, traveled south into Kentucky to unite with the southern Indians, the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw. They discussed uniting with one another and also with the British to fight the Americans who kept coming across Appalachia. Specifically, they intended to target the southern states, settlements in Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, and North Carolina. Hostilities began around June and July of 1776. Some of the time, both sides would go into one another's territory and attack settlements. Often there was a massive destruction of property, but not always loss of life. Sometimes there was a great deal of loss of life. If Americans captured a Cherokee, they were often sold into slavery down in the Caribbean. The Native Americans would sometimes capture people as well. On both sides, there were occasionally travesties. The Indian armies often numbered about 200 soldiers. And very quickly, the colonies realized that this attack and the confusion from these attacks resulted in all kinds of chaos on the frontier. And the only way to take care of this and secure peace on that western border of the colonies was a massive show of force. So a very large group of militia, numbering over 2,000, was sent to destroy the Cherokee settlements. And Washington, for his part, also sent a battalion of the Continental Army into Kentucky and Tennessee to end battles decisively. But oftentimes, when the armies were to reach a certain area, they would find that the Cherokee had abandoned their towns and burned them behind them. There was enough of a show of force, however, for the Cherokees to realize that they weren't going to be able to win this war, and many of the Cherokee ended up suing for peace. There was one leader among the Cherokee, however. His name was Dragging Canoe, and he refused the peace. So he splintered his group of Cherokee off from the other group of Cherokee, and he continued his war on the side of the British. Dragging Canoe would end up continuing his war well into the 1790s, far beyond the American Revolution. Daniel Boone would earn his reputation as being a frontiersman during those wars. And interestingly, Dragging Canoe also killed the grandparents of Davy Crockett, another American folklore hero. Now, my point in telling this story today is for you to realize that the Declaration of Independence altered relationships with Native Americans as well. It's important to realize that as government and sovereignty changed, the relationships between all these nations was in flux. But even more than that, the frontier was chaos. It was hard to say who was on one side and on another, because even within the Cherokee, people were splitting and finding alliances in some place and finding alliances in another place. The entire thing was very unclear, and in that chaos, there was a lot of conflict.